Now, the Japanese people honor people they describe as living national treasures. Amartya Sen is without doubt a living global treasure. He was born in India in 1933 and awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1998 for his analysis of famines. He summarizes that work as follows, quote, "No major famine has ever occurred in a functioning democracy with regular elections, opposition parties, basic freedom of speech, and a relatively free media, even when the country is very poor and in a seriously adverse food situation." He describes economics as his profession and philosophy as his love affair. He's steeped in the history of both, and he has had a lifelong preoccupation with the challenges presented by the pervasive and enduring presence of injustice within human societies. He's currently the Thomas W. Lamont University Professor and Professor of Economics and Philosophy at Harvard University, and he was formerly the Master of Trinity College, Cambridge. He's also been Professor of Economics at Jadavpur University, Calcutta, the Delhi School of Economics and the London School of Economics, and Drummond Professor of Political Economy at Oxford University. He was formerly Honorary President of Oxfam and is now its Honorary Advisor. His research has ranged over social choice theory, economic theory, ethics and political philosophy, welfare economics, public health, and gender studies. He writes wonderfully and accessibly, and his books have been translated into more than 30 languages. My personal favorites include The Idea of Justice, Inequality Re-examined, and The Argumentative Indian. Amartya, thank you most warmly for coming to speak to us tonight, and we look forward to what I'm sure will be a wonderful lecture. And on behalf of the Royal College of GPs, in recognition of your lecture and to commemorate this event, I present you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Of course, I'm tremendously honored. The medal may be a little early because you should listen to the lecture and decide whether I deserve it or not. But I'm really very grateful and indeed very deeply honored to be invited to give the John Hunt lecture at the Royal College of General Practitioners. And of course, it's a great privilege for me to be speaking to this distinguished gathering. Like most people, my association with doctors has come mainly through being ill. And I scored rather high in that department early in my life, having malignant malaria at age 12 and cancer at 18. But I imagine my real qualification in speaking at a meeting of doctors comes from my distinction in hypochondria. Indeed, hypochondria and I have been friends for a very long time. I can recollect an episode when I must have been about 12 that marked me out as our school doctor put it, an expert in worrying. Expert in worrying sounds much better in Bengali, I should say, but if not, I should explain a term of admiration. The episode related to the fact that one day I decided that I was having an early case of cholera. I had some stomach-related symptoms of the same kind I imagined that the beleaguered British imperialists used to grumble about and call Delhi belly. My school doctor assured me that I did not have cholera, and he then went on to say that in his medical practice he had noticed that cholera patients tend to be typically very optimistic. The fact that I had panicked so much was further proof that I did not have cholera. I found that remark tremendously consoling. So I stopped panicking and suddenly turned cheerful and optimistic. And then, of course, I was seized with a fresh worry. Surely my newfound optimism would be an indication of my having, rather than not having, cholera, according to the doctor's own criteria. So I went to see my doctor again and presented my new concern to him. He told me that he would prefer not to speak with me ever again. My hypochondria, however inconvenient it might have been, it did actually save my life when I was just turning 18. Shortly after arriving in Calcutta to go to college, staying at the YMCA hostel, I found a lump in my mouth on my hard palate and decided that it had to be cancer. My GP assured me that the lump was nothing like that and must be clearly benign. I got the same diagnosis from an oral specialist whom I went to see at a large public hospital in Calcutta. It used to be called the Carmichael Hospital. I think it's renamed now. Faced with this diagnosis, I wondered whether I would let the matter go. But then my hypochondria whispered in my ears and told me not to take no for an answer. So with the help of a medical student, who was a neighbor of mine at the YMCA hostel, I got hold of some books on the subject that he got for me from the medical college library. The books offered, among other things, detailed morphological descriptions of different kinds of oral tumors. And after reading them and a certain amount of self-examination, I decided that I had squamous cell carcinoma. But I could not get anyone to biopsy the lump. Another oral expert I went to see told me, "So you have yourself diagnosed that you have cancer. This is very, very interesting to me. But tell me first, what other serious diseases do you think you have?" "Nothing else, just cancer," I told him modestly. I did not, of course, get a date for a biopsy. Ultimately, with the help of a cousin of my mother, who was himself a surgeon, I did manage to get a biopsy done at the newly opened cancer hospital, Chittaranjan Cancer Hospital in Calcutta. When the result came, it said that I did indeed have squamous cell carcinoma. Grade 2, it added. The cancer hospital suddenly got into high gear then and unleashed the radium mold they had recently acquired. This was 60 years ago, and I do not doubt that they were doing the best they could under their circumstances and mine. Sitting up for hours each day for a week on a rickety chair with the radium mold in the middle of a lead case in my mouth, I did feel rather distressed, and the anguish increased as the radiation hit in. But I also had, and this was very important for me, the great sense of epistemological triumph. I did get it right. If I have remained throughout my life somewhat skeptical of informal medical certitude, that is certitude without proper testing, I had at least something to go by. This is not because I have a meager view of doctors, but because medical diagnoses are constrained by the time that doctors have in very pushed circumstances, and of course by the limited facilities that are available for proper testing, which are of course quite limited in poorer countries. Later on, reading the literature on the diagnosis and treatment of cancer in the poorer parts of the world, I learned about the huge gap there is in this area in many countries across the world, primarily because of lack of resources and affordable costs. And I must mention here that the Harvard Global Equity Initiative, to which both Harvey Feinberg here and I, with which I associated, Felicita Nall, who did her PhD with me many years earlier, was one of the great, and she's the director of it now, gave me information which I found absolutely arresting. This is a problem that would be quite unfamiliar here. This is not fire alarm, is it? No. Yeah. Unfamiliar here in Europe and America, where the problem is more to get potential patients to go for testing, rather than any shortage of resources for testing. This is unlikely to change unless, of course, the new philosophy of competitive cost-cutting goes much beyond where it has got so far. If that issue points to the meagerness of resources, let me now turn to the meager view of humanity on which I'm supposed to be speaking. The title was in fact suggested to me by the former president of the Royal College, Dr. Yona Heath herself, who invited me to give this lecture. She drew on a passage from my last book, The Idea of Justice, where this phrase occurs. I felt, of course, enormously honored that she had time to read the book and reviewed it in the BMJ, and very kindly too, if I may say. In the passage in question, I was expressing my complaint that many policy discussions are unduly restricted by a narrower view of humanity than can be justified. I'd presently argue that if we examine the problematic public policies that are being pursued today in many parts of the world, policies that end up influencing how our lives can or cannot go, at least a part of the origin of the difficulties, and in many cases the origin of the failures, relate quite closely to the limited ways in which human beings are seen in making these policies. I'll choose my illustrations from Europe, not excluding Britain, the United States, and India. This is a very general issue, but the immediate context in that book of mine, from where the phrase comes, in my complaining about the practice of taking human beings to be more meager than we actually are, was the characterization of sustainability in what is now called sustainable development. The idea of sustainability was powerfully outlined more than 2 decades ago, almost 25 years ago now, in a pioneering manifesto prepared by the World Commission on Environment and Development, led by the visionary thinker Gro Brundtland, herself a distinguished doctor who became the Prime Minister of Norway and later the Director General of the World Health Organization, that the WHO. This powerfully constructive departure took the debates on environmental policies away from the barren territory of quote-unquote limits to growth, as the so-called Club of Rome had called it, and removed a major source of battle between development and the environment. The Brundtland report defined sustainable development as sustaining, I quote, the ability to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, unquote. Later, Robert Solow would give a more mathematical expression to this formula. Growth may generate pollution and in other ways cause environmental harm, but by redirecting the pattern of growth, we can also conserve the environment, at least its impact on meeting human needs. This led not only to a momentous refocusing of environmental analysis, very positive in itself, but also to a radical change in developmental thinking. However, while this was a wonderfully constructive move, it can be asked whether human beings should be seen only as quote-unquote needy creatures, rather than as people who are concerned not merely with their own needs, but also with their values and reasoned commitments about the kind of world in which they would like to live and the world they would like to leave behind. For example, I may be committed to making sure that certain species do not get extinct. But this is not because I need, in any obvious sense, each of these species. In order for my normative values to be given importance, I should not have to claim or pretend that I need them in some sense. My political and moral voice on the importance of preserving, say, spotted owls should not be rendered inconsequential just because I have never seen a spotted owl and can live happily enough without seeing one, not to mention having one in my home. Indeed, my distress and concern about the extinction of spotted owls has nothing whatsoever to do with my own needs. It has something to do with our values, and my values in this case, against the extinction of species which have evolved over hundreds of millions of years. Or, to choose a different kind of example, if we have the reason to think that societies that suppress human freedom or which are characterized by gross iniquities in power are not the kind of society we have reason to want, then pursuing policies, even environmental policies, guided only by our needs while restricting human freedom or by sharply accentuating social inequality would not be seen, cannot be seen as a case of successful, sustained development in this reformulated perspective. Seeing human beings as having only needs, not values, is one way of making us meager. There are other ways as well. The basic issue to seize here is the importance of giving human beings their due. Attribution of unreal meagerness not only describes us, it also contributes to, and it is my claim, conceptual and practical confusion about the ends and means of public policy making. Well, I would argue that not seeing human beings in artificially meager terms demands particular attention at this time of rather large-scale, I believe, confusion of public policy. The recognition of the problem is not actually new at all. The old medieval distinction between agent and patient, on which there was a lot of philosophers writing, has much to do with this contrast between seeing human beings as creatures with needs, the patients, and seeing them, or us, as people with values, as agents, who are able to reason, to have normative thoughts, enjoy arguments, priorities, scrutinize commitments, and act on that basis. I begin, however, not with the medieval distinction, but with economics. And I go back to the year before I had my battle with cancer. In fact, when I first joined college to study economics in Calcutta. This was in 1951, when I registered at Presidency College to become an economist. Even as I was journeying from my school to college, a friend of mine warned me about my choice of field. Dipankar Chatterjee, so that was his name, and I had been together in school, both concentrating on physics and mathematics, which we both wanted to do at that time. And he went on actually to do physics in his college and would later on become quite distinguished in the field. But he was very skeptical of my moving to economics. Have you really thought through your decision well, Amartya? Dipankar asked me. Economics is an impossible science. It is not at all like physics. The material particles that you and I know do not have values, do not reason, do not change their mind, do not get angry or get overcome by sympathy or emotion. And we, in turn, do not worry about the welfare and liberty of physical particles. Do you really want to get away from the security of the physical world and take on such an unruly lot, that's the lot of human beings, as your subject? Dipankar was, of course, jesting. But there was surely a fair warning there. No matter how elaborately we describe people and their varieties of concern, priorities, values, commitments, potentials, we can still fall short of having an adequate view of human beings. We can still repeat King Lear's famous question, a question that Lear asked while sizing up Edgar, is man no more than this? As I came to know a bit more economics, it soon became clear how many ships have foundered in their journey through the rough waters of the subject by trying to render their passage smooth and easy by making truly heroic assumptions about human nature. It is not, of course, surprising, not at all reprehensible, that all economic analysis and all lines of policy recommendation involve some simplifying assumption about the nature of humanity, since there is no other easily workable way of making problems tractable. Simplification is indeed a necessary part of the pursuit of knowledge. It is crucial. It is a crucial, if somewhat underappreciated, component of epistemology and also a practical reason. And yet, some simplifications are awfully misleading and sometimes downright delusional, and also a simplifying assumption that is contingently useful in one context could be deeply misleading in another. Consider a contrast between two rather important theories of public policy in ancient India. Ashoka, who lived in the 3rd century BC, and Kautilya a century earlier, making him a contemporary of Aristotle. Ashoka was also a king, indeed a great emperor, who ruled over much of old India, including what is now India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. He began as a tough-minded emperor, keen on completing his empire over the entire landmass, and annexed an area, small area which didn't belong to him, which is now called Orissa, then called Kalinga, but became horrified by the brutalities of war which he led and won, and then converted to Buddhism, became a great champion of public policies to promote human welfare, including human health, and was very keen on promoting public discussion to promote public discussion for it to replace strife and carnage. Ashoka did indeed deserve the praise he got from H.G. Wells in his outline of history, that I quote from Wells, among the tens of thousands of names of monarchs that crowd the columns of history, the name of Ashoka shines, and shines almost alone as a star, unquote. Though this is relevant, I'm actually not commenting here, unlike H.G. Wells, on Ashoka's own attempt to do good. Rather, what I want to discuss is Ashoka's views of humanity. Ashoka's thinking on social justice included not only his conviction that advancing the welfare and freedom of people in general is an important role of the state as well as of the individuals in society, but also that this social enrichment can be achieved through reflection, voluntary good behavior of the citizens themselves, without being compelled only through force. Indeed, Ashoka spent a good bit of his life trying to promote good behavior towards each other, spontaneous as well as reflected in human society, which he thought was distinctly possible, since humanity, he argued, had the ability to reason and understand bigger ideas than their narrow self-interest, and to make deliberations influence their inclinations. Indeed, Ashoka erected stone tablets and pillars all across the country and some outside them, in different languages depending on the local tongue, with inscriptions to make human society benefit from the cultivation of what we can call the non-meagerness of humanity. As the historian Upinder Singh has noted in her book, in an article, in terms of outward conduct, Ashoka's in the Ashoka's edicts, the emphasis is on behavior appropriate to various key social relationships within and beyond the household, unquote. Ashoka's belief in the richness of human values was sharply in contrast with the diagnosis of Kautilya, who was the principal policy advisor to Ashoka's grandfather, Chandragupta, the Mauryan Empire, who established the dynasty and was indeed the first king to rule over nearly all of India. Kautilya was also the author of the celebrated 4th century BC treatise called Arthashastra, in Sanskrit broadly translatable in English as economics or political economy. It was indeed, in the 4th century, the first book with that title ever to be written in the world. In that cunningly reasoned work, Kautilya put his emphasis almost entirely on the incentives of rewards and punishments to be delivered through appropriate social institutions and legal rules. Kautilya used this institutional view, shorn of moral cultivation, both for political economy and for political and and for political and diplomatic pursuits. And he saw institutional features, including restrictions and prohibitions, and sometimes severe penalties, as major contributors to good conduct and necessary restraints on behavioral license. Many economists today do, of course, share Kautilya's venal view of humanity. And these views all contrast sharply with Ashoka's optimism about making people behave dramatically better, to persuading them to reflect more, and to encouraging them to understand that narrow-minded thinking tends to yield dumb behavior with terrible consequences for all. There is, alas, some evidence that Ashoka overestimated what can be done through behavioral reform alone. Sadly, Ashoka's vast empire dissolved into fragments of fractured territory not long after his own death. And it has been argued that this did not happen in India. There was no revolt at all during his own lifetime, mainly because of the awe in which he was held by the people at large, but also because he had not, in fact, and this is the point made by Bruce Rich in his book To Uphold the World about Kautilya and Ashoka, that he had not, in fact, fully dismantled the Kautilyan incentive administrative system of discipline rule that he had inherited from ancestors. There could be a debate on that. Nothing can dismiss the relevance of incentive-oriented institutional thinking of Kautilya, and I'm not trying to do that. And yet, even though Ashoka might have exaggerated the domain and reach of moral behavior, it's not at all clear that Kautilya was correct to be so comprehensively skeptical of the feasibility of having good results through social ethics. It seems plausible to argue that the perspective of both Ashoka and Kautilya were incomplete in themselves, and both need attention in thinking of ways and means of advancing justice in society. So that my main complaint is the complete replacement of the need for this duality by basically what I would call modernized Kautilyan perspectives. The need for the balance of the two types of considerations is focus on behavioral norms and that on hard-headed incentives remains very alive today in many areas of social policy. Consider the thorny question of corruption in economic transactions, which has plagued so many different societies, including my own country, India, but big issue in China, big issue in Brazil, across the world. There can hardly be much doubt that the absence of any penalties to corrupt and harmful behavior must be an administrative lacuna with rather bad consequences. That's clear. But can penalties alone do the job? It's not difficult to show that if everyone chooses to pursue their respective personal interests relentlessly, ignoring all behavioral norms, the cost of detection and monitoring, including monitoring the monitors and monitoring the monitors of monitors of monitors, would be quite astronomical. The societies that seem to have comparatively little prevalence of corruption for private gains rely not just on, and usually not even principally on on punitive incentives, though they are also present. They draw greatly on widespread existence of norms of appropriate behavior. When about 2 decades ago I was given the unlikely job, I was surprised that I was asked, of advising an Italian parliamentary commission, spectacularly named as Anti-Mafia Commission, chaired by a wonderfully wise public figure called Luciano Violante, who later became the head of the upper house, which went particularly into the relation between the world of corruption and that of violent crime, namely mafia. Studying that and looking at the evidence, I was struck both by the extent of the prevalence of corrupt practices in Italy in business transactions then. I was also impressed by the reasoning that the anonymously interviewed agents of corruption gave for their behavior. Perhaps the most commonly given reason was that everyone behaves like this, and there's nothing especially disgraceful or outlandish in such behavior. Another reason given was that any unilaterally chosen non-corrupt behavior will soon be wiped out from businesses by the superior competitive ability of the artists in corruption. If this seems like a vicious circle, it is that, but the important point here that the obverse of a vicious circle is a virtuous one of generating a momentum for change whereby a cluster of non-corrupt practice encourages other cases of non-corrupt behavior. I'm happy to say that even though corruption is still widely present in Italy, the kind of peak, this was in the early 90s, of what Italians used to call deontological failure, from top to the bottom, seems to have moved away from there. Similarly, while our treatment of the environment can clearly be pursued with much effectiveness through incentive systems, varying from imposing carbon tax to penalizing litterers, it's hard to think that environment-friendly behavior does not stand to benefit enormously also from changes in reflected behavior. It's difficult to bring about a litter-free world by vigorously detecting and booking all litterers. And for effectiveness of an anti-litter policy, there has to be much reliance on the emergence and acceptance of a non-littering behavior as a standard part of spontaneous conduct. Let me now move away for the rest of the lecture from the rather foundational difference between the Kautilyan and Ashokan understanding of human beings, a divergence of lasting significance and long-run relevance to policy making in the world, to the contemporary problems of the economic crisis, or rather crises, plural, that have engulfed America and Europe, and through them the rest of the world as well. Europe in particular seems to be doing even worse than America in coping with the after effects of the crisis, with a largely ineffective policy of doing it through austerity. This is a subject on which there are so many distinct elements, and on which there are so many different theories and explanations, that it would be silly for me even to try to pretend that anything close to a full explanation of the twin problems of disastrous crisis and the continuation of economic disaster in the post-crisis world, especially in Europe, could be given in this lecture. Rather, what I would aim to do is to offer a few thoughts on how the temptation to take human beings to be much more meager than they actually are have contributed to the origin and persistence of disastrous economic conditions. There are other aspects of these twin problems on which I have myself written, but which I shall not get into here. And if people are, in case that people are interested in my views about Europe, it's about, I think 3 months ago in the New Republic, I have the paper, it's called What Happened to Europe. It's the New Republic, it's an American journal. One bit of ammunition that would be quite useful in this analysis is to look at a combination of what I'm calling the Kautilyan and Ashokan perspectives in the political economy of Adam Smith, who has a stronger claim to being the founder of modern economics than, I believe, anyone else. There is abundant use of the importance of incentives in Smith's writings. Indeed, he saw the market system to offer, in general, a very good system of incentives in a large variety of circumstances. Smith was second to none in arguing against arbitrary restrictions on trade and exchange in the name of efficiency or equity. And yet Smith did not take that to be the whole world of political economy. Markets often fail and sometimes do not have an adequate reach. Of the many departures from the market economy that Smith argued for, I shall concentrate on three, each of which, as it happens, originate in Smith's first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759, and let me do a bit of publicity since the anniversary Penguin edition published in 2009, after a quarter of a millennium, had a long introduction by me. I take it as my Smith, and discusses some of the things I'm trying to discuss now. And then he pursued these ideas further in the second and more well-known book, The Wealth of Nations. Contrary to belief, there is no contradiction between the two positions that he did. One is much more development of the other. The first argument arises from Smith's belief that human beings are capable of a great deal of moral reasoning, and also of making reasoned norms of conduct so spontaneous that they can become totally straightforward, and they may even sometimes do not recollect the reasoning, but there is a reasoning behind that. That passage of Smith is totally wonderful. People would be ready to help each other, especially the poor and the disadvantaged, if the case for it emerges from transparent moral reasoning, and that's why public reasoning is so important. And in that light, Smith argued for the social case of public services to be delivered directly by the state, especially to the disadvantaged. He took particular interest in arguing for the great advantages of state-provided education to be offered free, and in general defended interventions of various kinds and I quote here, in favor of the workmen rather than their masters, unquote. This is from Wealth of Nations, by the way. Smith saw the task of political economy as the pursuit of, I quote again, two distinct objects. And I continue to quote Smith. First, to provide a plentiful revenue or subsistence for the people, or more properly, to enable them to provide such a revenue or subsistence for themselves. And secondly, to supply the state or commonwealth with a revenue sufficient for the public services, unquote. It's not hard to see why this point is critically relevant for the counterproductive nature, for assessing the counterproductive nature of the policy of drastic cuts in public services, both in the Eurozone, usually imposed on the weaker economies in that zone, and, oddly enough, voluntarily chosen by the United Kingdom. Paul Krugman and others have argued, rightly I think, that cutting public expenditure is harmful in a situation of recession for very good Keynesian reasons. It reduces effective demand in a situation where there's idle capacity, increases unemployment, and weakens the economy. That argument is strong enough. But Smith's reasoning went well beyond that in the relation between public services and institutions for helping the disadvantaged. Helping the disadvantaged rather than adding to their woes. And it links with the fundamental values that uphold the fabric of society. It's worth mentioning here that austerity, which is often confused with necessary economic reform, and it's a disastrous confusion, economic reform to eliminate corruption and to make rules fair, is very, very different. These two are very different from each other, austerity and economic reform that are needed. Because many reforms are indeed needed in Europe and have been needed for a long time. But to note that reforms aim at eliminating the impact of cupidity and unfairness from which the relatively more affluent tend to gain most is very different from austerity, which hits most the people at the bottom of the ladder by chucking them far away from any ladder going anywhere. The cause, for example, of eliminating, say, income tax evasion can hardly be very well promoted by cutting down the incomes of those who are so poor that they are not required to pay any income tax anyway, or will come into the lowest category. Smith's reasoning contrasts with the implicit belief, which seems to do some work today in making people tolerate austerity. I still find it odd that people tolerate it so well, and even perhaps to love austerity, is that if a policy hurts, it must be doing some good. Actually, I think in Man and Superman, I think Ann Tanner says that, I'm afraid it's a slightly racist remark by an Irishman about the English, saying an Englishman feels very moral when he is only uncomfortable. The undermining of the foundational values of mutually helping society, values that the European welfare state tried hard to capture, had not yet proceeded so far in Britain, despite its largely counterproductive and mostly unsuccessful policy of austerity, as it has in, say, Greece or Portugal or Spain. But even if these penalties were to cure, these penalties distributed very unequally, were to cure the economic stagnation, which is extremely unlikely, but even if they did, the hope that no harm would have been done to the long-run social and economic cohesion and prosperity of these societies would be hard to vindicate. Important as Keynesian reasoning is, there's something rather larger and grander than Keynesian economics involved in the counterproductive nature of Europe's ongoing policy priorities. I'm not commenting much on the United States, excepting when it comes to the beginning of the crisis, but a similar debate was, of course, a big factor in the political debates going on in the United States recently, even in the context of the election, but of course quite some time elsewhere. Smith talked about the terrible consequences of thinking very little about the poor and concentrating too much on the lives of the rich. It's odd that the only thing of Smith that is recommended in standard economic course is when he is saying that people don't need to be benevolent or altruistic in order to seek the market. But that's just about the seeking the market, what makes the market function. And that may be about exchange, how do you get the distribution right, and so on. Smith put this point about his critique of biased thinking in public affairs this way, I quote from Smith. This disposition to admire, almost to worship, the rich and the powerful, and to despise, or at least to neglect, persons of poor and mean conditions, is in fact the greatest and the most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments, unquote. Underlying the plural institutional structure that Smith proposed lies the active operation of moral values that he saw central to social living. And it would be hard to think that after what looks increasing like the barbarity of ongoing policies, especially on what has been imposed in much of southern Europe, what Smith called the corruption of moral sentiment would simply vanish. The second Smithian point of relevance is his insistence that while profit-seeking provides good incentives, it can also, under many circumstances, lead to irresponsible behavior, excessive borrowing and lending, and to wrong-headed investment, with very disastrous results for all when the bubble bursts. Smith warned about the presence of those whom he called, I quote from Smith, prodigals and projectors in derailing the market economy, and argued for state regulation in dealing with these cases. It's quite interesting in terms of history of thought that a person who thought that Smith was being very anti-market without reason was none other than Jeremy Bentham, who complained about Smith's hostility. He actually wrote a letter to Smith in 1787. There was a political theorist writing perhaps to the greatest economist alive, explaining how the market economy works. And Bentham effectively proposed that Smith should leave the market alone, rather than talking about prodigals and projectors. And he added, Bentham, saw them as innovators. This argument, by the way, I've heard very recently too. Smith was not persuaded and made no changes in his statement on this subject in The Wealth of Nations in the following print. In the gradual removal of most regulations on business and financial transactions, beginning with the time of President Reagan, the USA followed broadly the Benthamite route, and the prodigals and projectors, who played such a big part in the crisis of 2008, matched Smith's description in an uncannily close way. If the prodigals and projectors show that the opposite of meagerness need not come only from an abundance of fine norms, as Ashoka had tended to assume, but can also come from the presence of hugely risk-taking behavior of seekers of quick profit, there are different aspects of the non-meagerness that we have to bear in mind in thinking about the threat of the human mind. The third point I want to draw from Smith, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion, so I mustn't prolong this talk, is more constructive and throw a different kind of light on the origin and continuation of the current economic crisis, and throws light on when capitalism succeeds, how does it in fact succeed, and to what extent. Of course, the distributional problem remains, but how does it go on and on without the crisis? This concerns the role of trust and confidence in people's good moral sense in generating a successful economy, as opposed to relying simply on the incentive of profit-making. Smith's example on this, and he discusses several examples, is quite telling. I quote from Smith. When the people of a particular country have such confidence in the fortune, probity, and prudence of a particular banker as to believe he is always ready to pay upon demand such of his promissory notes as are likely to be at any time presented to him, those notes come to have the same currency as gold or silver, from the confidence that such money can at all times be had for them, unquote. So while discussing trust, the role of trust, Smith also discussed why such confidence need not always exist automatically, or need not survive in advanced circumstances, so that a climate of mutual trust has to be cultivated and indeed fostered. The devastating consequences of galloping mistrust and collapse of mutual confidence, which led the development of the 2008 crisis, you may remember it began and then it spread, would not have puzzled Smith, who integrated a broad and emphatically non-meager in many different ways, view of humanity in his understanding of the economic event and the demands of economic policy in his time, and they, I fear, remain relevant even today. Both the crisis of 2008 and the mishandling of recovery, with the deep confusion between austerity and reform, relate quite closely to a gigantic misunderstanding of the nature of human beings and their assumed meagerness. I've taken a bit longer than I wanted to take, but this seems like a good moment for bringing the lecture to a quick, if belated, end. Thank you. Of course, one of the problems in teaching a class on austerity is that it's very difficult to think of a model which would tell you to do the austerity in a situation when you are in a state of huge recession. I mean, it's very difficult. There is I think Paul Krugman keeps talking about confidence fairy. That is, somehow, when you cut everything, everyone will have such faith in each other that they will suddenly make tremendous investment. But of course, that is an assumption which is so dramatically naive that it seems a bit embarrassing to say that. So I think some models fail and others fail even more. But then the remedy is to try to get somewhat better assumptions. But you won't be able to, as my friend Dipankar Chatterjee said, you are not going to be able to capture the complexity, all the complexities of the human mind in any model. The question is what, in this context, the relevant model to use. And they have been useful. I mean, Keynes was also a model. And I think it fails. I'm not a Keynesian, unlike many other friends of mine, including Paul Krugman. But I know I agree with him on this point. But because of the fact that his model really also assumed a very meager, took a meager view of humanity. Keynes had almost nothing to say on inequality, nothing to say on poverty. In fact, his rival, Pigou, thought to be more right-wing, had often a great deal more to say. The great measure of inequality today is that by Atkinson, which is a direct successor of Pigou's original measure of inequality. So I think we have to see what their interests are and relate your assumptions to the kind of problem that you're trying to deal with.
Okay. Oh, now we have lots of people. Halfway down on this side, Christian.
Thank you, Professor Sen. My question is really to do with health. We all know that drugs and technology are costing more and more. Have you any advice to us as an economist on how we best cope with this in terms of policy and decision making as doctors in this country?
Drug
cost, the cost of healthcare.
Cost of healthcare, yeah. No, the short answer is no. I mean, it's I'm always very flattered when people assume I know much more than I do. This is a subject for research, I don't know. There is a real problem there. But there is also the fact that the cost of production of drug varies enormously in different places. I think when Cipla, for example, started making AIDS drugs, it cut it down the cost by 95%. So I think there has to be some research dealing. Now, admittedly, that was done by reverse engineering. They didn't spend the money on research. But it isn't quite clear how much the accountability of costs go into the price structure. I mean, the pricing is always a major thing. People here, the younger people here, would not remember the days, but it's only about 15, 20 years ago, when suddenly it was decided that you could not have duty-free and traveling within Europe. And everyone said, my God, this is going to completely ruin so many businesses because the duty-free things are so priced low, mainly because they don't pay duty and that gives jobs to a lot of people. I've never quite understood what the case for giving tax break to those who travel more comes. I benefit from it, though I have to say I'm not a great duty-free purchaser. But then, of course, the government didn't listen, and they did abolish it. And then all these duty-free shops came back again, offering it at pretty much the same price. Where did that come from? That must have come from a high profit margin. And they were buying, it's not surprising to economists, what the consumers would bear. And if the cost is this much, then it'll bear a lot of profit. If the I mean, this is not exactly a perfectly competitive model of an economy, and it isn't one. So you have to be a much clearer vision of how lack of competition, in this case oligopoly, works. And that applies to a great extent to the drugs. But I should not really pontificate on that, because I would quite like to see a more serious work than I've seen so far. There are some nice papers, but I would like to see something. So I applaud your question, but unable to answer.
We're not going to be able to deal with everybody. Richard, then this lady in pink. So if you have one down here in the front row, and Christian, if you could go to the lady halfway across in the pink, which we'll probably start with because of the... wave at him. Thank you. So, yes, if you start, and then I'll come to you.
Hello.
Not lady, sorry.
No. But I'm a psychiatrist, so I can see. I can see where that error comes from. I'm here with a GP. And actually, it's a concept in psychiatry that I was reminded of when you were talking about Adam Smith, and there was this quote about our view of the wealthy and our view of the poor. And it reminded me very much of a concept that we have in psychiatry, although we borrow it from psychologists, of something called attribution theory, or the primary attribution error. So that says that we tend to credit positive events that happen to us to stable internal factors. So I have won the lottery because I'm a good person, or no, a better example, I have achieved something because of an inherent thing in me that is inherent to my personality. This, an unfortunate thing has happened to someone else because of an inherent failing. And then the flip side is that negative things happen to other people because of failings inherent to them. Negative things happen to me through accident and chance. Now, this leads to treatments for addictions and all sorts of things, because it leads on to kind of various different techniques to shift people's views that are entrenched about themselves and about other people. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about how this can be done on a kind of more societal level to kind of shift people's views about the poor and the wealthy to reach a more stable equilibrium, something a bit healthier.
Yeah, I think you're making offering a fairly sophisticated psychological explanation of that statement of Smith. Smith's own explanation was rather simpler, that people like mixing with the powerful. They offer better wine, or I guess better scotch. And you know, they're also powerful, and therefore we tend to kowtow to them. And the dialogue in the media might be very concerned with their lives rather than with the people at the bottom end. This is a big problem. I'm finishing a book on India at this moment jointly with Rodriguez. Part of the thing that's gotten wrong in India is that the public dialogue has actually been seized by the relatively better off. That doesn't mean the tycoons. But if you took the top 20%, and then of the top 20%, looked at the bottom 10%. Now they're called Aam Aadmi, ordinary people. They demand that diesel be subsidized and electric power in urban areas be subsidized. Now, most Indians don't have any instrument in which diesel is used. And 35% of Indians don't have any power connection at all. India has a higher level of undernourishment than any other country in the world, and there's still people go on discussing when India might overtake China in GDP growth rate. Now that kind of blindness comes to a great extent from the corruption of public dialogue which is taking place. By the way, Smith had a lot to say on that too, in the theory of moral sentiment. Now, do I dismiss what you're saying? No, I don't. That may well be a factor in that. I don't think my view at the moment is that I don't see it as the principal factor. I think it's much more the Smithian factor that you talk about people you know, those you mix with, and who are these people and what their interests are, and you get dominated by it, and you really have to detach yourself as a person who has a vocal voice in the media from that life to another life. 47% of Indians don't have a private toilet at home, don't have a toilet at home at all. It's disgraceful. 96% of Bangladeshis have it now, because that became one of the public discussion, media discussion. So I think the limitation of the Indian media, which leads to the limitation of the Indian democracy, makes a big difference. Now this, your praise of democracy, which you quoted, by the way, and I was always flattered by, it wasn't in my novel. My novel didn't mention it. It's all about social choice theory. Okay. It's also something I believe in. Right. But I'm afraid my citation in Nobel, the first article, somebody said, oh, well, first time a non-mathematical work was being given this prize. And if you look at the first 8 articles, the first one begins by saying necessary and sufficient condition of binary consistency of majority decision. I don't think exactly non-mathematical would be. So I think it's true India hasn't had famine in a way that China has had. On the other hand, the reach of democracy depends on its practice. And I think Indians got very sluggish on this. And UK too, yeah.
I'm only going to be able to take one more, and then you're going to
Richard has it.
So Richard has the microphone, so if you go.
Thank you. First, thank you very much for your very fine lecture. A question about sustainable development, which you mentioned and touched on. As you know, there's a furious debate going on right now about the meaning of sustainable development in the post-millennium development goal era. And the furious debate includes a question about where does health sit in our future, in the phrase that the UN uses, in the future we want. In your thought, do you think health has a special set of characteristics that we should prize in thinking about our future? Or is health just one quality amongst many that deserves no special preferences or privileges? And I wonder, whichever answer you choose, you might give us some guidance as to the reasons why.
I think health position is quite different from that of others. I was reading the other day one of Tennyson's poems addressed to Virgil, and who was born in Mantua, and he talks about, I salute you, Montavena, whose poetry I always admired, and so on. What does the word salute come from? Salute, of course, means health. And Italians still preserve it. Now, I think it's the fact that saluting each other is just about health indicates it has a special role in a way that other things don't. Now, I think one argument can make about knowledge and education and so on. But health has a kind of immediacy which is very difficult to avoid. I would say that one should not be too dogmatic to think that health is, in every context, the most principal concern. But I think if sustainable development isn't about health, then I think something enormously big is being missed there. But also running there, I would put education and so on. And I think the point I was trying to make was a different issue, namely that, well, I mean, it relates to it, of course, namely that it's not a question of what people need. I mean, I find it difficult to think that, what are people's needs? How do I know what these needs are on the basis of argument? And this is it's a classical distinction. If you, for example, take what in many ways is probably Karl Marx's most profound work, namely his last, namely Critique of Gotha Program, where he changes the focus from his criticizing the German Workers' Party for wanting to give workers their productivity. But instead that he said ultimately we have to give them what they need. And that comes the formula from each according to his ability to each according to his need. But then he says you may not be able to do it now because he talks about incentives. And that's actually very profound that way. But then the question always arose for someone who was interested in all of Marx, for example, beginning with the manuscript of 1848, where there's a lot of skepticism about how do you know about needs, excepting through public discussion. That, German ideology, all these things, discuss it. So I think our concept of needs as it emerged, and I think that's what Brundtland also meant, is something that is arrivable by public discussion about what the needs are. And that's what will vindicate the position of health on which your question is. On the other hand, there were a number of things, I don't know whether people remember it, when during Cheney's administration, when he was vice president, he was in charge of the environmental planning. He wouldn't announce in the public media who are the members of the commission, because the public didn't have a right to know. Now that, of course, already eliminates one of the precious freedoms that we have reason to sustain, namely the freedom to know, freedom of information, freedom to debate, freedom to discuss. So ultimately, I think we have to see needs as a part of public reasoning, and the book of mine from which this quote came, which Ivana was so kind, certainly namely the idea of justice, it really is about public discussion, public reasoning. And of course Smith is one of the heroes in that, as indeed others like Marquis de Condorcet, Mary Wollstonecraft, probably the most neglected philosopher in Britain, certainly in the 18th century. So I think I would like to pose the question one step back in terms of what would emerge in a public discussion. And would health emerge very likely at the very top? Yes, I would imagine so.
Okay, well, it's very hard to call a halt to this, though some of you may be slightly desperate for a drink, which I believe is outside, and a few of you may be able to get an extra question in if you're quick. But I just want to thank you so much. Everything you said is so intensely relevant to what is going on in the health service in this country today, where we see austerity actively making our poorest patients sicker. I think there is no doubt about that. And to have your encouragement really to continue the critique of austerity and the effects it has on the poorest has been invaluable. So thank you very, very much. And I hope we can see it in print, actually.
Okay.